my paper is entitled How to Become and Remain a Writer. And I start with a short piece that I entitled Autobiographia Literaria, with apologies to Coleridge and Frank O'Hara. And I will draw your attention to their much more successful works about how to become a writer and to remain one. A short quote from my memoir, Chernobyl Strawberries. Between the ages of 4 and 24, I wrote poetry every day. It is debatable how far one could divide the days into good and bad as regards the production line, but on some I wrote as many as 400 lines of verse, running up to 10 separate poems, while on others I polished a couplet until it had not a single word in common with the original version, and then back again. I'm not at all sure where all that poetry came from. My father wanted me to become a doctor. I grew up in the socialist Yugoslavia of the 1960s and 70s, where this kind of parental ambition was not unusual. The most valued professions offered respectability, a secure income, kept you away from politics, and provided a craft, albeit not in the sense in which we now talk about transferable skills at British universities, but one which fitted the much more calamitous and impoverished world my parents had grown up in, a world which saw wars and revolutions, internal and external exile, and where freedom of speech was at worst non-existent, at best measured out with coffee spoons. Whether knowing how to stitch a hem of a coat or an open wound, handicraft fed you more reliably than knowing how to compose a sonnet. My father did not see studying medicine as necessarily conflicting with my desire to write. My poetry was something he was proud of, in some ways too proud, until I grew old enough to know how to avoid the dubious honor. I was often summoned to the drawing room to recite a poem to bemused family friends. Some of his favorite writers, Chekhov and Bulgakov, Céline and Maugham, were doctors. He himself had obeyed his parents' wishes in his choice of study. He was a keen historian at school, but had studied mathematics. Outwardly, his life seemed incredibly boring. He wasn't allowed to talk about his work. During most of my teens and early 20s, I had very little idea what it entailed. I barely noticed the lacuna at the time. It turns out he had studied language as keenly as I have ever done. He had spent his career as a code breaker in the general staff of the Yugoslav National Army. Has father regretted his original choice of study? He claims not. Does he regret mine? He has apologized for trying to influence me. He thinks I did the right thing. I opted for the university course, which was most commonly pursued by poets when creative writing did not exist as an option. I studied literature. The only way to study writing as a craft would have been to do dramaturgy at the Faculty of Dramatic Art, but that was an option open only to half a dozen people, and I wasn't interested in writing plays anyway. Such academies were part of the university system, like here, but they had strict entry quotas determined by perceived need rather than demand. And even then, the need was arguably overinflated. Which small state needs 6 playwrights a year, or 6 film directors, or 12 painters? Was studying literature helpful to my becoming a writer? Without setting out to do so, my particular degree course, Comparative Literature, produced as many writers as some of the best creative writing schools. Even its first ever graduate was a writer, one of Yugoslavia's finest, Danilo Kiš. None of those writers were full-time authors, Kish included. He taught Serbocrat as a lector in French universities. Those 4 years of undergraduate study remain in many ways the happiest and intellectually the most exciting years of my life. At first, I wrote more poetry than ever. By year 3, however, things began to change. I wrote less and less. I translated and published Jonathan Culler's On Deconstruction. I wrote book reviews in which there was nothing outside the text. I wanted to be a critic and an academic, and I had a sense that I couldn't be both. The company of poets became almost embarrassing. I may have had the talent, but I was also too conventional in some ways, too keen to excel in the tasks before me, and those tasks did not include writing poetry. Here's an excerpt from J.M. Coetzee's Youth that I find evocative. What is wrong with him is that he is not prepared to fail. He wants an A or an alpha or 100% for his every attempt and a big excellent in the margin. If he were a warmer person, he would no doubt find it all easier. Life, love, poetry. But warmth is not in his nature. Poetry is not written out of warmth anyway. Rimbaud was not warm. Baudelaire was not warm. Hot, indeed, yes, when it was needed. Hot in life, hot in love, but not warm. He too is capable of being hot. He has not ceased to believe that, but for the present indefinite, he is cold, cold, frozen. I'm talking about myself, but I see this story as a template of a particular moment, a template which the option to study creative writing may have altered for good. Nor is the template necessarily rooted in the specific ideology of the state I grew up in. Many of my fellow English literature academics in British universities were once would-be writers. At school, English meant both composition and interpretation. University required just interpretation. Without setting out to be so, literary study, if pursued seriously enough, can be unhelpful in creative writing simply by standing in the way. The knowledge you gain through it is useful, but also axial. I will be facetious and compare it to preparing to be a jockey by qualifying as a vet. I believe I'm not wrong in claiming that before creative writing invaded the university, often growing from within the English department as a more seductive younger brother, there used to be a wall between two worlds, creative and critical, which suggested that an ability to operate in one eroded your competence in the other. A few academics wrote creatively, but they seemed almost suspect and remained defensive about that other activity, as though creativity was bound to render brains mushier, as though, in ways which are difficult to pin down, it remained essentially childish. And most famously, the main audiences of the two great Oxford dons, who are sometimes now brushed aside with embarrassment by those who take themselves a little too seriously, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, were of course children. To be creative is in some ways to be irresponsible, unable to put away childish things. Leap forward a few decades, and today you will find a fair number of critics and academics working on novels and poetry collections, revisiting those early aspirations, the way people search for their first loves on Facebook after failed marriages. Many retire with the dream of renting a small place in Paris or Prague where they will write that debut novel. Unlike the violin and tennis, writing forgives a late start. What is the best way to be a writer? It might well be preferable to be able to write full-time from the beginning, but that has never been an option for more than a handful. The figures are stark, and they would be even starker if you removed the less visible forms of subsidy from those who claim to write full-time: spousal incomes, inheritance, trust funds, lodgers. Novel writing in particular often looks like a middle-class lottery. The ratios between the numbers buying tickets and those winning are roughly the same. In the case of former Yugoslavia, a country of 22 million people, where I first thought of writing as my destiny, it was even harder to win. There was only one full-time writer, and he was a Nobel Prize winner. If you wanted to be a writer, you had to be something else too, and full-time. Would studying medicine in the end have been so different? It might almost have been easier to retain your native belief in the power of writing that way. Academics often complain about increasing burdens of teaching and university administration, but they tend not to complain about the amount of time the university sets aside for their research, other than to suggest it is insufficient. For the many creative writers who enter university to teach, even that small amount of time is a first. To be paid to write what they want 1 day a week, this is a standard 20% that academic jobs leave aside for research, is more than any other career path would offer. If I had the necessary control groups, one Vesna, who was a full-time writer, one who was a full-time GP, and one who was a full-time academic, I could compare their creative outputs at particular stages and reach more reliable conclusions for the purposes of my talk. I do know that the arrival of the creative writing department in my the arrival of creative writing in my university English department 10 years ago was good news for me, enabling me for the first time to write creatively, yet to find that it counts in terms of career progression, and to teach not just writing, but also literature in the way I like to teach it, more focused on literary form, less parceled out, less confined by the boundaries of period and nationality. As the specialisms in English literature became narrower, I found the syllabus of creative writing liberating. If I was working on short story with my students, we could read short stories translated from any language and any epoch. At the heart of creative writing is love of literature, the written word, an affection that is now all too often lacking in the politicized and highly theorized study of literature itself. At Belgrade, I studied Marxism for 2 years, a required subject, while at the same time taking the history of aesthetics as an elective. I would not have believed then that the former would turn out to be more useful for my academic career than the latter. I don't dodge identity and ideology. On the contrary, I have published some highly political work, but I remain interested in ideas of beauty and literary merit, which an English department seems no longer to know what to do with, yet which are the focus of creative writing. We talked about death of the author 30 years ago, little suspecting that the critic was going to die first. So, creative writing was, on balance, good news for me and many of my colleagues. And it is, I assume, even better news for British universities, or they would not have embraced the discipline with such enthusiasm. But is it good news for the students? Here is a short excerpt from an article in The Guardian published a year ago. Creative writing courses are a waste of time, according to the novelist and creative writing teacher Hanif Qureshi, who says that a lot of my students just can't tell the story. Qureshi, whose debut novel, The Buddha of Suburbia, won the Whitbread First Novel Prize, was speaking at the Independent Bath Literature Festival on Sunday. He was made a professor at Kingston University, where I teach, last autumn, when he said it was truly an exciting time to be part of the creative writing department. But on Sunday, Qureshi told the Bath audience that, when it came to his students, it is probably 99.9% who are not talented, and the little bit that is left is talent. A lot of my students just can't tell the story. They can write sentences, but they don't know how to make a story go from there all the way through to the end without people dying of boredom in between. It is a difficult thing to do, and it is a great skill to have. Can you teach it? I don't think you can, said Qureshi, according to The Independent, which sponsors the festival. But Jeanette Winterson, who teaches at Manchester University, disagreed with Qureshi. She told The Guardian, "My job is not to teach my MA students to write. My job is to explode language in their faces, to show them that writing is both bomb and bomb disposal, a necessary shattering of cliché and assumption, and the powerful diffusing of the soul-destroying messages of modern life, that nothing matters, nothing changes, money is everything, etc. Writing is a state of being as well as an act of doing. My job is to alter their relationship with language. The rest is up to them." A spokesperson for Kingston University told The Independent that Qureshi's course was extremely demanding and valuable, and that the author, playwright, and screenwriter is employed for his thought-provoking, inspirational contribution, which he provides through supportive masterclasses, tutorials, and PhD supervisions. Students consistently praise him and benefit from his advice. The article offers a familiar scenario. The setting is a literary festival sponsored by a newspaper. The main character is a literary name with a reputation for delivering good value if you are a journalist in search of copy. Creative writing degrees are a waste of time, may not be as exciting as calling for euthanasia booths on street corners where old people can terminate their lives with a martini and the medal, a provocation delivered by a rival author, but it is a gift that keeps on giving, particularly when spoken by someone who draws a paycheck from the activity he finds so pointless. It is certainly more newsworthy than discussing most novels. It touches on many shared activities about the purpose of university study and the endlessly looming spectre of the so-called Mickey Mouse degrees. In their time, English literature, sociology, media studies, etc., etc. It is not the first of such utterances by Qureshi. 8 years previously, while a research associate on the creative writing course at Kingston, he said the following at Hay. "One of the things you notice is that when you switch on the television and the student has gone mad with a machine gun on campus in America, it's always a writing student. The writing courses, particularly when they have the word creative in them, are the new mental hospitals. But the people are very nice." At this point, it is worth observing that while the British broadsheets are driven by the need to produce provocative copy, they also have a vested interest in defending the teachability of creative writing. Some are involved in the business. Selling journalism is no longer enough either. Thus, in the spirit of journalistic objectivity, the waste of time thesis is usually followed by an antithesis, a statement for the opposition, preferably an equally big name who frequently defends the discipline in a way which seems almost designed to prove the validity of the attack in the eyes of Joe Public. My job is not to teach my students to write, my job is to explode language in their faces. The synthesis comes with the institutional stamp, prefabricated components of corporate communications assembled by a press office engaged in damage limitation. Extremely demanding and valuable, challenging and thought-provoking, etc., etc. The article as a whole makes me very happy that I work at the British University. It is still a place of relative freedom, particularly compared to the corporate world outside it. In other places of work, rubbishing your own product as joyously and publicly would be unthinkable, although one has to concede that Hanif does enjoy the protection of a famous name. Even Writer Centre Norwich might not be as supportive as my university was if one of its most famous employees pronounced at a literary festival that the work she is doing is essentially pointless.
Well.
I don't happen to agree with Hanif, and I don't necessarily think that he agrees with himself, but I still like the fact that he can deliver a provocation and keep his job. Second, I like the unacademic quality of both the attack and the defense, the quality of outsider art in both the waste of time and the explosion of language, which reverberates with uncorporate shock in a corporatized place, although it makes me wonder if either of them really know it. How many exam boards have they had to sit through? Have they had to take their modules through to validation? Ensured that their educational aims are mapped to their outcomes in ways that are reflected in the assessment process. The creative writing proletariat, the army of those who deliver most of the teaching and whose festival appearances, when they manage to write something between marking and exam boards, seldom feature in national newspapers, might have formulated things differently. In other respects, the conversation is eerily, perhaps drearily, familiar, although it is not always easy to understand why it manages to grab headlines decade after decade. If the value of creative writing degrees is based on the number of full-time writers they produce, then most disciplines in the humanities could be subject to similar scrutiny. Is it because of the astonishing rise of creative writing in spite of the repeated claims about their dubious value? I recommend Andrew Cowan's article, The Rise of Creative Writing, both for its arguments and its hard data. Or is it that so many journalists are penning novels in their spare time, often with the same dream of throwing away their day jobs, shared by a substantial proportion of creative writing students, even when both groups know better than to admit to it? Why writing seems so much more appealing than the dream of constructing a bridge, working in an office, or teaching in a primary school is beyond the scope of my 20 or 30 allotted minutes. We live in a celebrity culture, and it is hardly surprising that people notice the celebrity and the wealth of some writers. The strange fact is, although there was some displeasure with Hanif's pronouncements among the students, very few of whom would have personally been implicated. His work was, when he spoke, concentrated on a supervision of one PhD student and some master's dissertations. And although the university would not have seen it thus at the time this article was published, the impact on recruitment was nil, or perhaps even positive. Students come to Kingston to study creative writing in large numbers, and many say explicitly that they want to work with Hanif. Perhaps it is in the nature of writers, when hearing that 99% are talentless, to assume that they are 1%. How could you keep going otherwise? Poeta nascitur non fit. What is talent? I will give a little quote from José Mourinho here. The style of how we play is very important, but it is omelets and eggs. No eggs, no omelets. It depends on the quality of the eggs. In the supermarket, you have class 1, 2, or class 3 eggs, and some are more expensive than others, and some give you better omelets. So when the class 1 eggs are in Waitrose and you cannot go there, you have a problem. Was I born a poet? or have I become one? I'm not paraphrasing Simone de Beauvoir, but playing with a maxim often attributed to Horace. The history of poetics and autopoetics, from Plato to, Dave Eggers, struggle to define ideas of inspiration and gift. In relation to creative writing, the meaning of inspiration, the meaning of individual talent, and further up the ladder, genius, is in many ways at the heart of the many vexed debates. The Greeks went into furor poeticus, poetic madness, through which they were given the gods' or goddesses' own thoughts to write down. The Romantics saw themselves as Aeolian harps tuned to the divine or mystical dimensions. Kant saw genius as the talent that gives the rule to art, and art, rather than science, had the quality of genius. Newton was not a genius because he could demonstrate the steps that he took to reach his discoveries. No Homer or Wieland could show how their ideas originate. Nowadays, we tend to speak of genius as scientific. Einstein or Stephen Hawking built an equal measure of education and boundless intelligence. Shakespeare might have had some of that quality, but few writers post-Enlightenment would be described in those terms. We are understandably uncomfortable with the idea of natural inequality. Even in antenatal classes, we are encouraged to think that every child is a genius. You only need to discover the gift. And just as uncomfortable with the idea of the inexplicable. Were Homer and Wieland to submit their outputs to the ref, they would not have been allowed to get away with it. To the Horatian, poeta nascitur, non fit, the poet is born, doesn't become one, Ben Jonson and Lewis Carroll replied, poeta fit, non nascitur. I have a lovely poem by Lewis Carroll somewhere around here, which we might have as a handout. Creative writing veers on the side of agreeing that the poet is made and not born, and it is arguably in its interest to do so. Craft is teachable. It can be learnt by imitation. It can be honed by repeated exercise. Yet there remains that, at the heart of it, which may not be in our gift to impart, a certain facility, a talent. It is not easy to recognize, but then neither is it easy to recognize in budding literary critics or historians. They could be just as stone deaf. Why do we worry so much more than the academics in those fields? And why do the students still come in such numbers? They dream of creative lives lived to the full, as I did, yet they also think it more easily and instantly achievable than I did. They believe in vocational training in the way I did not. Their schools and their society as a whole encourage them in that. They're not wholly wrong. If you desire to be a writer, then learning how to compose, structure, edit, and publish seems more useful than learning Latin declensions or the causes of the First World War. They get a lot of individual attention. Their writing is looked at more thoroughly than in other humanities degrees and is much less likely to be infected by jargon. They also get a lot of solid, formal literary study. In time, a few will become writers, many will become teachers of creative writing, most will find other jobs where often there will be scope for disciplined creativity and write for themselves, if the desire does not die, at weekends. You could, of course, restrict the numbers to suit the perceived needs of the British economy, as the Yugoslav universities once did, but that is not the way British universities or any universities anywhere work anymore. On the contrary, they encourage creative writing departments to expand, to bring more and more future writers and fees in. Paradoxically, at the very end, I return to the question of talent, that which Qureshi identified as standing roughly at 1% in the group which had already been sifted by university admissions. This is the responsibility I find the most difficult to deal with as a teacher, the pressure to recognize it and nurture talent while knowing that even among the talented, the majority will ultimately fail if success is being able to realize your full potential in writing. As I have failed, as most writers fail, it may be easier to help the talentless realize their full potential than it is to cultivate the gift. Thank you.